Welcome to the deep dive. We got a request to really dig into Robert Cialdini's influence, the psychology of persuasion. Someone wants to understand all about those weapons of influence. Get ready for some aha moments. You're about to learn how to spot and maybe even how to resist some seriously persuasive tactics.
Yeah, it's amazing how often we just react automatically to certain cues without even realizing it. Today, we're going to explore all 6 of Cialdini's weapons of influence. We'll use some examples from the book and some from everyday life.
All right, let's just jump right in then. The first weapon up is reciprocation. So that's all about like that feeling of obligation, that feeling that you got to return a favor. Cialdini's Christmas card experiment illustrates this perfectly.
That's the one that really shows how powerful reciprocation is, even when that favor is totally out of the blue, right? Like uninvited. It's just deeply ingrained in us, this principle. You see it everywhere. Like charities, they include those little gifts with their donation requests. Or salespeople. They'll offer concessions when you're negotiating. They're tapping into that urge to give back, even if the initial, favor wasn't really a favor you wanted.
Makes you think twice about those free samples at the grocery store. Are you really just trying it? Or is there some kind of pressure to buy after?
Exactly. And actually, the size of the favor, it does impact how obligated we feel. But even those small gestures can be powerful. Think about how just a simple compliment can make you more likely to say yes to something later on.
That's such a good point. It's not just about the big gestures, it's the subtle things too. Okay, so moving on to the second weapon, commitment and consistency. This one taps into our desire to just be consistent with ourselves, even if it means sticking to a decision we kind of regret later on.
Exactly. Cialdini uses that example with the toy companies, how they manipulate sales of Christmas toys.
Oh, yeah.
That's a classic example of this. They'll intentionally undersupply the popular toys.
Oh, so the kids can't get them?
Yeah, and that makes the parents end up promising them to their kids.
Oh, that's rough.
Right. Then, after Christmas, they ramp up the supply. They know that the parents now feel obligated to actually keep their word.
Oh, man, talk about playing on parents' guilt. It's genius and devious all at once.
Yeah.
It's not just about toys, though. Think about signing those petitions or publicly pledging to support some cause.
Right. Those are public commitments, even small ones. They increase the internal pressure to follow through,
Yeah.
right? You said it. You got to align your actions with your words.
Definitely.
It can be used for good, though, this principle.
Yeah.
Think about setting public goals. That can increase your motivation to achieve them.
That's a great tip. Making a public declaration that can really hold you accountable. All right, up next is social proof. So this is the whole everyone else is doing it, so it must be right mentality.
It's that monkey see, monkey do, right?
Right.
It's why advertisers, they use those testimonials. They show average people using their products, especially when we're unsure how to act. We look to others to tell us what to do.
Cialdini uses that example of the Jonestown mass suicide. That was chilling. Really shows how social proof, especially in a really unfamiliar and isolating environment, can amplify compliance.
That was a really tragic event, and it highlights how powerful social proof can be. Even when the actions are really harmful, it's particularly strong in uncertain or ambiguous situations.
It makes you realize the importance of thinking critically for yourself and not just following the crowd blindly. Okay, let's move on to liking. This one seems pretty straightforward. We tend to say yes to people that we like. But are there some hidden depths here?
Oh, yeah, there are. It's the factors that can actually influence liking. They can be surprisingly subtle. Cialdini points out attractiveness, similarity, compliments, and cooperation. They all can actually increase liking and therefore compliance.
Okay, so that salesperson that tries way too hard to act just like you might be employing this tactic.
They could be. Yeah, it's really important to be aware of those calculated attempts to boost likability. Genuine connection, that's one thing, but straight up manipulation, that's another.
All right. Next up, we've got authority. So this is all about that almost automatic yes that we give to anyone in a uniform or with a fancy title.
Think about Milgram's obedience study. It shows how powerful authority figures can be, even when what they're saying, their commands, are conflicting with our own morals. We just obey out of habit a lot of the time. We don't even think critically.
And it's not even just about actual authority either, right?
Right.
It's the symbols, too.
It is. Think about titles, uniforms, even luxury cars. They create this aura of authority, right? They influence our behavior without any real substance behind them.
Really makes you think about how much we just rely on those external cues to make decisions. All right, On to the final weapon, scarcity. This is the limited time offer principle. Makes us want things just because they're running out.
Scarcity creates a sense of urgency and a sense of competition. Cialdini explains how companies use those limited editions and deadlines to pressure buyers. They're tapping into our fear of missing out.
Oh, and remember that cookie experiment. Those scarce cookies, they were rated as tastier, even though they were the exact same as the plentiful ones. It's incredible how scarcity just warps our perception of value.
That experiment shows how our emotional responses, they don't always line up with rational thinking. Recognizing this psychological pull of scarcity can really help you avoid those impulsive decisions that you'll probably regret later.
So there you have it. Cialdini's 6 weapons of influence, each with their own unique way of swaying us. Understanding these tactics is a huge step towards navigating those everyday moments where we feel pressured or unsure.
Yeah, absolutely. Knowing about them, that's just the start. The real power is going to come from recognizing them in action, in your own life, and using that awareness to make better decisions.
Well, this has definitely been an eye-opening start. Now, let's shift gears a bit and dive into the fascinating stories Cialdini uses to illustrate these principles in action. What are some that really stand out to you?
One that jumps out right away, that story about the POWs in the Korean War, how the Chinese communists used all these subtle tactics to influence their behavior. It's a fascinating look at how commitment and consistency can be used in even the toughest situations.
That was a wild one. You wouldn't think like writing down some pro-communist statement or agreeing with a tiny criticism of America could lead to anything serious.
That's what's so sneaky about that fit-in-the-door technique. It's those small commitments, they pave the way for bigger ones later. Once someone starts agreeing, it's like psychologically harder to stop. They've already taken a few steps,
Yeah.
It's easier to just keep going.
It's like those little yeses just build momentum,
Yeah.
pulling you down a path you might not have chosen if you saw the whole thing from the beginning. Makes you realize how important it is to just be aware of those tiny choices we make every single day.
Totally.
Mm.
And it's not just about wartime propaganda or whatever. Think about how this happens in everyday life. Have you ever caught yourself saying yes to something way bigger than you meant to just because you already agreed to something small?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Like that time I agreed to help a friend move just a few boxes and
Yeah.
ended up painting their whole apartment that weekend.
Mm.
It's crazy how those little commitments snowball.
Speaking of snowballing, another one that stood out was Cialdini's take on the Hare Krishna Society, how they used reciprocation to get more donations, even though they were pretty much unknown and not always welcome back in the 70s.
Right. Giving
Yeah.
people a flower or a little book before asking for money. Even people who weren't into their whole, movement thing often felt like they had to give something back.
Shows the power of that initial gift, even if it's small, in triggering that whole reciprocity rule. Even if you didn't want it in the first place. It's hard to shake that feeling of, I owe you one.
Makes you wonder how many times we've fallen for this without even noticing. It's those subtle moves, those favors you don't see coming that can really get you.
Exactly. That's why knowing about these principles is so important, so you can see them happening in real time and make a conscious choice about how you're going to react. Speaking of subtle influences, let's talk about social proof. That staged epileptic seizure experiment really drives home how strong it is.
That one was so interesting and kind of creepy. I think it showed that people were less likely to help someone having a seizure if there were a lot of people just standing around.
Exactly. Pluralistic ignorance, it's called. Everyone's looking at each other for clues on what to do, but nobody does anything because everyone else is doing the same thing.
So in an emergency, being around a bunch of people might actually make it less likely you'll get help. That's messed up.
Highlights how easy it is to get swayed by everyone else not acting, even if it goes against what you normally do. It's like we think, well, if nobody else thinks it's a big deal, it must not be.
Makes you think twice about those situations where you're not sure what to do. Maybe speaking up or taking action is the right thing, even if you're the only one.
Good reminder that sometimes you got to trust your gut, not just copy what everyone else is doing. Especially when things are unclear, we got to be more proactive, less reliant on those social cues.
Now that you mention it, Cialdini used the Jonestown thing to show the power of social proof too, right?
He did. A chilling example of how, in a weird, isolating environment, people can get way too reliant on what others are doing to guide their own actions, even if it leads to bad outcomes.
That example really makes the point clear. Social proof, it isn't always a reliable guide. You got to think critically. Don't just follow the crowd blindly, especially when things are stressful or uncertain.
For sure. And that brings us to another powerful principle, authority. Cialdini uses a bunch of fascinating stories to show how easily we can be influenced by symbols of authority, even when it's not legit authority.
That story about the nurses, the ones who almost gave a patient a lethal dose of medication just because some random doctor on the phone told them to.
It reminds you how deep our obedience to authority goes. We're practically programmed to trust people in positions of power, often without questioning what they tell us. The nurses knew that dosage was dangerous, but they almost followed the order anyway.
It's a little scary how easily our critical thinking skills can just shut off when someone seems like they're in charge.
Yeah,
Makes you realize how important it is to question those in power, even if it feels weird or disrespectful.
right. Authority figures, yeah, you should respect them, but never follow their orders blindly. We got to think for ourselves and challenge authority when we need to, especially when it comes to safety and well-being.
Speaking of challenges, let's talk about liking. It seems so simple, but like we said, there are all these subtle things that affect how much we like someone.
Cialdini uses the example of Tupperware parties, how liking can be used to sell more stuff. It's not just about the products, it's about the whole social scene. People will buy from their friends, even if it's not the best deal.
It's like those multi-level marketing things where they rely on personal connections to sell stuff. People feel like they got to support their friends, even if it means spending more than they plan to.
Exactly. And it's not just friendship. Cialdini points out how being attractive, being similar to someone, giving compliments, cooperating, all that can be used to get people to like you more, and then they're more likely to do what you want.
So that salesperson who's like super complimentary about your outfit, maybe they're trying to subtly make you like them more so you'll buy from them. It's wild how these little gestures can sway us.
It really is. That's why knowing about these tactics is so key. You can see when someone's using them, then you can decide if you're going to let them work on you or not.
These stories really make these principles come to life. You can understand the theory, but seeing how they play out in the real world, that's powerful stuff.
Totally agree. Cialdini is such a good storyteller. His examples help us see that these, kind of abstract ideas actually have real-world consequences. They also show that these principles can be used for good or bad. It's up to us to decide how we'll use this knowledge.
Well, I'm definitely seeing these weapons of influence everywhere now.
Yeah.
It's like having a new way of looking at the world. But knowing about them is just the first step. What can we do to fight back when someone's using these tactics on us? Feels like we've cracked some secret code of like human behavior. A little scary, but also kind of cool. Like if we know the moves, maybe we can, block them.
That's the whole idea. Awareness is the first step. Once you see these principles are real, you start noticing them everywhere. And when you do, that gives you a chance to stop and think, am I being persuaded or am I being played?
So how do we actually resist this stuff when it's happening?
Yeah.
Easy to talk about it, but when you're face to face with someone who's good at this, that's got to be tough.
It is. Cialdini gives some good advice, though. Like with reciprocation, he says, to try mentally reframing the situation. Like if someone does you a favor, but it feels like a sales tactic, just tell yourself that's what it is. Takes away that feeling of obligation.
So like instead of feeling like you owe that super nice salesperson something, you think they're just trying to make a sale. That helps, right?
It does. You separate yourself from the emotional side of reciprocation, you can make a clearer decision. Same with social proof. Remember that just because everyone's doing something doesn't mean it's right. Look for other opinions, do your own research, and don't be afraid to do your own thing if that's what feels right.
Yeah, sometimes doing the right thing means doing what nobody else is doing.
Yeah,
That's tough, though, especially when you feel that pressure to fit in.
it is. But think of it like this. Courage is a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. Every time you resist those little pressures, you're building up your resilience. You won't be so easily manipulated. You'll be more in control of your own choices.
You mentioned control, and that's something that hit me about Cialdini's work. He doesn't make us out to be like helpless victims. We have a choice. We get to decide how we respond to these tactics.
Exactly. Cialdini's point is understanding this stuff isn't about being totally immune to influence. It's about being more aware and making better judgments. It's about noticing when we might be swayed by unconscious stuff or emotional stuff, and then taking a minute to decide what we want to do.
He even talks about how we can use these principles to influence ourselves positively. Like that thing about making public commitments to motivate yourself to reach your goals.
That's a great example of using this stuff for good. You want to start a new habit. Tell your friends, join a group that already does that habit. Even give yourself little rewards for sticking with it. You're using social proof, commitment, even a little bit of reciprocation to push yourself in the right direction.
Like turning the tables, using these tactics on ourselves. That's kind of cool. But also, gotta admit, it's a little humbling. Makes you realize how much of what we do is driven by stuff we're not even aware of.
It does. That's why Cialdini's work is so important. It shows us those hidden things that shape our thoughts, feelings, actions. Knowing about them, that's the first step to making smarter choices that feel better in the long run.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to wrap things up. What a trip it's been, exploring Cialdini's world of influence. We've learned how to spot these tactics, see how powerful they are, and even how to resist them. But even more than that, I think we've learned a lot about ourselves and how to use this knowledge to live more intentionally.
I couldn't agree more. Cialdini's work is a real gift. It's like a guide to navigating all the complicated parts of human relationships with more awareness, more wisdom, and more honestly.
So to everyone listening, remember, you have the power to choose. You're not just a puppet. Use this knowledge to make smarter, more informed decisions. And don't forget to use your influence to make the world a better place.
Until next time, happy influencing ethically, of course.